My name's Glenn Patterson and I'm standing in front of Belfast City Hall, which was opened in 1906 on the site of the 18th century White Linen Hall. So in one way or another, this has been a focal point of Belfast life for a couple of hundred years. Round the back of the City Hall, which is the kind of focal point that writers tend to prefer, on the corner of Donegall Square South and Linen Hall Street, once stood the International Hotel. There in January 1967, the inaugural meeting of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was held, and there in 1999 I set my fourth novel, called The International. I went through school reading English fiction, French fiction, Russian fiction, American fiction. I'd never been to any of the places that I was reading about, but I accepted the fact of them just by virtue of their presence in those novels. At that stage I'd read very few novels set in Belfast, and almost none set in the Belfast that I'd grown up in, which was a city of department stores and housing estates as well as civil strife. I wanted, when I started to write, that Belfast to have the same reality for readers from other parts of the world, the same validity that London, New York, Paris and St. Petersburg had for me. I said I'd read very few novels when I was growing up set in Belfast. Shortly after my first novel was published, somebody gave me a copy of a novel by Janet McNeill called The Maiden Dinosaur. Like her other novels, Tea at 4 o'clock for instance, it vividly portrays Belfast in its post-war, pre-Troubles days. She's sometimes dismissed as regional, parochial. She's a very, very fine novelist. And she also wrote a very prescient essay in the 1950s called Seed, Root and Stem, in which she talks about the need to look beyond the accidental influences of country of birth, upbringing, and look to the individual identity and the original thought within every person. And I think of my own work, I think many of the characters are similarly looking for communities that they have chosen rather than the identities that are thrust upon them by the accident of birth. I'm now standing at the back of Belfast City Hall, and in the buildings behind me, not quite in the corner, was the International Hotel. I wish I could describe for you Belfast as it was then, before it was brought shaking, quaking, and laying about it with battens and stones onto the world's small screens. But I'm afraid I was not in the habit of noticing it much myself. What reason was there to, after all? It was simply the town. I could give you the statistics you might find in any book, population, industry, numbers of churches and bars. Or I could tell you that a week before the events I'm describing, I'd woken in a room not a quarter of a mile from the City Hall to the sound of chickens fussing in the yard below. Only in recent years had the journey on foot from southern tip to northern fringe, from extreme east to far west, ceased to be a comfortable stroll. Even now, few people I knew missing their last bus home would have dreamed of taking a taxi. The Belfast urban motorway was to change all that, of course. The Belfast urban motorway was to give us 4-lane, 6-lane carriageways in the sky, primary distributor routes, ring roads, inner, outer and intermediate, with flats where there used to be ratty houses and growth centres where now there were small outlying towns. We were going to be modern tomorrow, but for today the city was little different from the city I'd been born into. Ask me then, did I like it? And I don't know that I would have understood the question. You might as well have asked me, did I like breathing? If I'd seen other cities, I would have understood that Belfast was in its way beautiful. As it was, I reckon there were probably better places to live, and probably places a whole lot worse.